One of the reasons why people mobilize so passionately for democracy is that they realize that in the absence of constraints, constitutional constraints, on the power of the rulers, the ruled are subject to any abuse and to any depredation by those who've managed to corner power. One only need visit a country like Zimbabwe, where the ruling party, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU-PF, has been in power for 3 decades now, and where a once prosperous and beautiful country, rich and self-sufficient in agriculture, and with high levels of education and lots of opportunity and commerce, has been driven into the ground by a predatory regime that has increasingly been bent on simple domination and extraction of wealth for their personal benefit, leaving people to complain that the ruling party is nothing more than a thief, leaving them with no jobs, no money, no water, no infrastructure, and no hope. This is why the leader of the opposition, Morgan Tsvangirai, has rallied successfully so much of the country behind him, but at a very serious price to his own safety and that who have joined the political opposition. It is why organizations in civil society that engage in human rights monitoring and in advocacy and legal defense, like the famous Zimbabwean organization Zim Rights, have been very embattled and constantly under threat of arrest, intimidation, or even physical violence. We face analytically the paradox of China. The People's Republic of China, one of the most successful developers of the past half century. No country has lifted more people out of poverty more rapidly at any time in the history of the world than China has done since its development miracle took off in the late 1970s with the reforms of the late Deng Xiaoping. But this remains a communist state, in the political sense at least, with a ruling party that brooks no opposition, allows little in the way of dissent, and still dominates the media and civic space, and in which if anyone were to unfurl a banner here in Tiananmen Square, outside the Forbidden City, calling for freedom, for democracy, for political pluralism, for a free press, for the rule of law, they would be very, very quickly accosted and arrested before they could gather anything like the crowds that gathered in Tiananmen Square in 1989, demanding these things before they were brutally suppressed in the crackdown on June 4th. It's not only in China where development and democracy, or aspirations for it, are beginning to collide. We see in Vietnam a similar transformation underway of rapid economic development, beginning at a lower level than China has so far achieved, but certainly visibly happening, to transform the society, to create a more pluralistic society, as in China, the rise of the internet, the rise of the blogosphere, the rise of a class of lawyers who have training, maybe it was meant to be in commercial law, but who know what the rule of law is. People who've traveled the world and have new ideas about political accountability, political equality, popular sovereignty, and the rule of law. Now, we've seen in different historical eras, as in elsewhere in East Asia, in Korea and Taiwan, successful circumstances of the gradual transformation of power toward greater democracy, the gradual growth of civil society, and then the crossing of a threshold when a more pluralistic civil society, a more empowered political opposition gain new self-confidence and demand for political rights with new resources, new ideas, new organization, in ways that authoritarian regimes must accommodate in some way and negotiate with, or be at their peril in terms of something happening more suddenly in terms of political mobilization. So we will be studying these transformations socially and what impact they have politically. A key question in this course, maybe the central one, overarching, is when democracy emerges, why it emerges, and how it can effectively, durably emerge to constrain the power of a single ruler or a single party or a narrow elite. In other words, how does popular sovereignty emerge? This is something that I have become quite sensitive to, having watched the transition unfold in its final stages in Taiwan, and having seen the Republic of China, Taiwan, emerge from a quite authoritarian regime with a single dominant party controlling, and even the absence before 1987 of legal opposition parties, to a very spirited electoral environment in which different parties could emerge and mobilize, and people could freely criticize the government as they wished, in which the ruling Kuomintang, KMT, could be unceremoniously tossed out of power just 4 years after the transition to democracy was completed, with the first free and fair presidential election that the KMT won in 1996, tossed out of power in 2000, and then returned to power in 2 elections later in 2008 with the election of the KMT candidate over the DPP, President Ma Ying-jeou. We need to ask, what is it that happens in a country with perhaps very deep and historic political divisions and serious philosophical and interest divides between parties, that can lead a ruling party like the Democratic Progressive Party to humbly accept defeat in an election, as it did in 2008, apologize for their failures and shortcomings, and then reorganize and return to compete in another day, which is the very core principle of democracy. We can look simply in East Asia or even in Greater China and see the changes that are going on. For example, in Hong Kong, where a political leader who was once seen to be a conservative member of government and someone who had called for tough enactment of internal security laws, the now very popular and prominent member of the Legislative Council, Regina Ip, has become a prominent advocate of democratic change in Hong Kong. It might interest you to know that legislator Ip was a master's student at Stanford, and before that came to Stanford University for executive training in our business school, and took a version of this course during her earlier time at Stanford. So hopefully many of you who are taking this course might someday yourselves be political leaders who will help to do the work of deepening democracy, of negotiating for democracy, or of strategizing about how your own society can move from whatever point it's at to a point that is more open, more participatory, more accountable, more responsive to the popular will.